The American theorist Stephen Covey says that to be successful you need to begin with the end in mind. One of your ends, besides learning with this task, is to meet the requirements of the Independent Source Investigations ISMG. So in this video we just want to explore that ISMG a little bit to highlight the important elements of it. This is what the first part of your ISMG that relates to the ISI looks at. Probably one of your key ideas here is to get your head around the analysing criterion. So let's focus in particularly on how to get the best grades, the 7 or 8 range, and look at the wording of it. Firstly, we have a discerning and detailed identification, examination of the features of primary and secondary sources. We need to make informed explanations about how the evidence in those sources is related, contributing to development of your key inquiry question. Now, some of those elements are going to be in the analysing section of your final ISI. But I think you'll also find that how the evidence from sources contributes to the development of the key inquiry question will come up in your rationale. So keep an eye on those elements. It's also important to think about how this is going to be graded. So while we're going for the 7 and 8 mark section, have a look at the words that come up as descriptors, as the adjectives, if you like, for the lower grade areas. Instead of discerning, we very quickly see words like appropriate and adequate appear. So you've got to go, I want to be above appropriate, above adequate. I want to be in discerning and detailed. I want to be informed, not reasonable. I want to get into a spot where we're moving just beyond identifying, examining and explaining. We're at that higher level, and we certainly don't want to be any further down. Let's have a look at the evaluation section. In the evaluation section, we have to make discerning judgments, so be strong in your judgments, be brave in your judgments about whether a source is useful and reliable, how useful it is, how reliable it is. This is your professional judgment. If you like, a professional opinion. This isn't just any old opinion. There's nothing wrong with having professional, informed, historical opinions, making informed judgments. We don't turn around and say that a legal opinion or a medical opinion is invalid because it's an opinion. We have to make these evaluative judgments and be brave in our own voice. Now notice in the highest grade area, it is discerning judgments about both usefulness and reliability. The and matters. It disappears later on. We need to be looking at judgments that are drawing upon primary and secondary sources and identifying within those sources different perspectives. This comes up in your source analysis within the ISI, and we need to reason these out well. We need to corroborate them. So we're not just going to 4 to 6 sources. We're actually going to other sources to corroborate what's in those 4 to 6 sources, to compare your 4 to 6 sources with others. So this is bigger than just 4 to 6 sources. You're looking at more sources than that. Okay, now the wording changes, and I think this is worth you picking up on. Instead of discerning judgments in the 5-6 area, they're just effective judgments, and they use evidence all the time from primary and secondary sources. If you're only going to primary sources, if you're only going to secondary sources, you will not get into the top 2 criteria. Have a look at, or 2 mark bands if you like. Let's have a look at the way this changes now. The judgments use primary and secondary sources and or now refer to perspectives. You might not refer to the perspectives in your source analysis. Now your judgments are reasoned and corroborated. If you're not corroborating, if you're not going to that wider suite of sources, then you won't get into the 5 to 8 band at all. Without corroboration, you're out of that. And by the way, you won't even get into the 3-4 band if you have a look down further. When we're in our 3-4, we're talking adequate judgments about usefulness or reliability. And by the way, have a look at that in the 5-6. And or sneaking in instead of and. If you're not doing usefulness and reliability, you can forget about the 7 or 8. Now we're talking about sources. If you're using only primary or only secondary sources, you're now a 3-4. Okay? Again, your judgments have to be appropriate rather than reasoned or well-reasoned and corroborated. No corroboration, no 3, 4. Okay? You can't get a 3 or a 4, a 5 or a 6, or a 7 and 8 unless you're drawing upon that wider suite of sources. Go beyond your 4 to 6. Corroborate beyond there. Look for evidence to back up your ideas. Back up what you're finding in those sources. When you're backing it up, finding other voices that echo, that demonstrate some sense that the source is representative of a wider voice, you're not corroborating. Therefore, you won't get even a 3 out of 8 in evaluating on that dot point. Have a look at the last few that we're desperately trying to avoid. You'll notice that the statements of your evidence refer to only one source. If you're doing better than one source, then you should be getting out of the 1 or 2 areas. One source and or one perspective. Get out of that one zone. Okay? I guess if it's one source and one perspective, you're probably sitting on about a 2 for that dot point. Okay? So you really want to be getting up to 8. You could really hurt yourself in the evaluation criteria. Let's now think about usefulness and reliability and features and look at the sources that you could be using. One of the things I've picked up here is that you've got a whole range of tools and they tease out a whole set of different aspects and sources that come up in your ISMG. Basically, my handwritten scribbles next to you here, or next to these ideas, show where the tools pay off. Wherever you see an E, that would suggest these kind of judgments you make about reliability, representativeness, accuracy, authenticity, about perspectives are fitting into the evaluation criteria. Wherever you see an A/F, we're starting to talk about analysing and identifying features. If you can identify the context, you're perhaps talking about analysing the source, you're talking about features within the source. If you're identifying the certain acts of individuals or groups, we're talking about analysing a feature of the source. When we're talking about beliefs, attitudes, and values, this is perspectives. It's evaluative, probably. Motives. When we're talking about purpose, we're talking about the origins of the source. These are all elements of analysing and evaluation. Use these tools. They're not the only tools that are out there, but teachers have developed these tools in a variety of contexts for a variety of reasons to tease out elements of sources. Use them wisely, use them flexibly. Different teachers have used each of these different tools at different times. You can draw upon all of them to attack these ISMG descriptors. Think about what you're doing, use them to guide your analysis. Finally, I'd like you to have a look at this little diagram about the usefulness and reliability of sources that's coming out of some British teachers. And this is from a British historian, a British teacher, from an online blogger who's sharing his ideas. When they're talking about how useful a source is, they're talking how much use is the content. How much does it say and what doesn't it say? Where are the silences? And Indigenous history, we often have a lot of silences. Notice how this particular writer is saying you need to make deductions, you need to read between the lines, you need to look at what's inferred. Use your background knowledge. Sources rarely give a whole truth. Use your background knowledge to identify what's left out, that wider reading. Provenance is interesting. It's where that source is coming from, what voices are behind it, and how reliable they are. At this point, this author has picked up on the nature of the source. Was it private or public? Was it designed to inform, persuade, something else? What its origin is? What the context is? Is it primary or secondary? Was it close to the events, far away from the events? The purpose of the source. The motives, the agenda behind the source. What are they hoping to do here? To inform? To persuade? Is it objective, subjective? Is it opinionative? And so on. So I think that's a really good starting point to think about what gets discussed in your analysis.